So Dr. Willms is the founder and the president of the Learning Bar, Inc. He is the past president of the International Academy of Education and a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. From 2002 to 2017, he held the Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Literacy and Human Development at the University of New Brunswick. Dr. Willms has published over 200 research articles and monographs pertaining to youth literacy, children's health, the accountability of schooling systems, and the assessment of national reforms. In 2018, Dr. Willms developed the Educational Prosperity Framework, and this is a framework that focuses on the evaluation, monitoring, and action that can be taken by schools and school districts to ensure that all children have an equal opportunity to thrive. This framework embraces a life course approach to child development that sets out a course set of metrics relevant to children's growth, literacy, development, achievement, and well-being at 6 stages of development. So during the first session, Dr. Willms will summarize some of the research findings over the past 5 years in using the framework in Canadian schools. He will share lessons learned and present the impact of leadership development on educational capacity, student achievement, and staff and student well-being. Once again, we just appreciate all of you taking the time to be here. These sessions are so informative, so we would ask that as the session is progressing, if you would turn off your cell phones and just to turn off emails, we would really appreciate that. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Doug.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Thomas. Welcome, everyone. It's great to see everyone here, and I really appreciate you coming on this cold day. I feel a bit remiss not having a pink shirt. Our staff had a pink shirt day just 2 days after Valentine's Day, because we had a staff photo with our pink shirts. I don't know why it was then, but and 2 days before that, we have a very good chef in our staff who makes these beautiful cookies, and she made a set of 25 cookies for Inclusion New Brunswick, which is, you have Inclusion Alberta here. It's an organization that supports community living for people with intellectual disabilities. Anyway, she wrote on them, "Inclusion is love," which I think is good for Pink Shirt Day, it's good for Orange Shirt Day, it's good for everything, and I think that's really, it's one of our core values, and so there we go. So I'm going to talk about educational prosperity. And before I start, I want you to just, I got a task for you. I want you to try to think back of when you first decided to become most of you were teachers, I presume, at some point. When you first decided to become a teacher or an educator, was there one indelible moment that stands out for you? So try to think about that as I work through my experience going forward. So I called it Our Journey, Our Passion, because I'd love to hear from some of you, or you can type it in if there's I don't know if we have a chat thing, but anyway. I've tried this before, and 3 times I've done it, I've broken out in tears, just welled up from me from nowhere in front of a big audience. But I think I'm going to get through it today without crying. So I grew up in Treaty 4, and as you know, Treaty 4 stretches across the southern part of Saskatchewan, and a little bit into Alberta, and a little bit into Manitoba. So this is a wee boy, we're going to call him Noah, who is in Treaty 4, coming home from his first day of kindergarten. And the way things are right now in Canada, his chances of graduation are somewhere around between 20 and 30% if we don't do things differently. And I firmly believe that we can change that. So there's a little map with, you can't really see it very well. There's Treaty 4 there across, and you can see it just stretches into Manitoba and Alberta a little bit. So, and here's Moose Jaw, where I grew up in the 1950s. Lori Myers knows Moose Jaw. And so it looks pretty much the same. I went there not too many years ago, and The cars are different, though. And there's the Scott Building, which is infamous because it had the Connaught Billiards down in the basement, where many of us had a misspent youth during our high school days. And so there's Moose Jaw. And in grade 10, I had the great fortune to work as a counselor at Camp Easter Seal, which is a camp in Watrous, Saskatchewan. We have someone here from Saskatoon who'll know Watrous. And it's still going strong. And I ended up working there for 5 summers. It had a real big effect on me becoming a teacher. And even now, when we have people interviewing people for the Learning Bar, first question I ask is, have you ever worked at a summer camp? Because I think it's just such a fantastic experience for youth to have that experience. So I finished my first summer there at the end of summer after grade 10, and I went back to Moose Jaw, and one of our neighbors asked if I wanted to work part-time in this institution called the Saskatchewan Training School, this huge monolith that is out to the south of Moose Jaw. And so you came in every day. I was a temporary psychiatric nurse's aide. That was my role. And you'd come in and you'd punch in your card in the main office, and they'd assign you to one of the wards. And if you went down that way, they called them the low grade. And if you went the other way, it was called the high grade. Imagine. And the wards were named after, in the low grade, they're named after bird names. There's robin, lark, and so on. And then in the high grade, they're named after indigenous tribal groups. There was Huron and Cree and so on. Imagine, I mean, that was the state of affairs. The indelible experience for me, I came home after that first day and cried. I cried for 2 days. My mom said, no, you're not going back there. I said, oh yeah, I'm going back there. And because it was just such a contrast from being at Camp Easter Seal and encountering people who had a whole different set of values around the worthiness of human life. And that's what underlies ableism, it underlies sexism, racism, all the isms, and so on. And so to me, about all of those, it's all about a different conception of human beings, about their value to society. And so to me, that was it. And so on I went, and I worked there part-time. And I ended up working a lot of night shift. And my mom wrote me these notes. Douglas was absent this morning because he was not feeling well. And after 31 days in a row of missing mornings at school, the principal hauled me and my mother in, single-parent family, and said, like, what's he got wrong with him? He's missing all these mornings. And she said, well, he's working all night at the institution, and he sleeps in the morning. And he said, well, he can't do that. And she said, how's his marks? My marks were great because all night, as soon as the residents were asleep, I'd be doing my homework. Anyway, they booted me back into school for a little while, and then I quit school, and halfway through grade 11, decided I was going to go full-time to be a psychiatric nurse's aide. That was going to be my profession. And as I was waiting to get that in line, I was working at Connaught Billiards until my mother phoned the pool hall and said, and I picked up the phone and said, Connaught Billiards. Doug, is that you? Anyway, she had the good sense to get me back in school, and I finished out grade 12 and graduated on schedule. So that was my story. Then more than that, several years later, I had the good fortune to go to, this was the first Indigenous community that I went to in Saskatchewan, Muskowakan, which is not too far from, Saskatchewan, not too far from Yorkton, and very close to Camp Easter Seal. And I was in the school, I was having a lot of fun with the kids, and the elders came over, and we went outside in the playground, and they pointed through this little grove of trees, said, that's the old residential school there. And I was aghast that it was still standing. It still is standing. We closed our last residential school in Saskatchewan in 1996, if you can imagine. And the Saskatchewan Training School from the previous slide, that wasn't closed until about 5 or 6 years ago. And your similar center here in Alberta, the Missioner Center, which I've also visited, it only closed like 10 or 15 years ago. So that's how long these things have persisted. So to me, that's being there. I went with one of our Indigenous colleagues, Lori Whiteman, and I said, Lori, I can't believe I feel so ashamed that I grew up in Moose Jaw and didn't know that there were all these residential schools just down the road in the Qu'Appelle Valley, less than a 2-hour drive from where I grew up. And she was very kind. She said, but don't you understand, that was by design. That's always struck with me, that was by design. And so we still have that today about things that are segregated by design. And those are the kinds of things that we can change. So I think of all of you as catalysts. The very fact that you're here, I so appreciate you being here. You are the catalysts that are going to address some of the problems that we're facing in Canadian education right now. And we have one of our Indigenous communities to use this term, literacy catalyst. So I came up with this definition of a catalyst using some other various dictionary definitions. So a catalyst is someone who causes great change to happen. And I think I'm counting on all of you. You are the catalysts that are going to take us forward. And I've identified, I'm going to talk briefly about our educational prosperity framework. Then I'm going to talk about these 3 wicked problems. And a wicked problem is, we distinguish between tame problems and wicked problem. A tame problem is one that you can use the whole, the regular thing. What is the problem? What's the cause of the problem? What are 5 possible solutions? And what's the best possible solution? That's kind of standard organizational management stuff. But a wicked problem is one that you cannot address easily. It's multi-causal. You don't know where you're going to land when you go in. I kind of think of it, those of you know about, I'm sure you all know about action research in the schools. It's like a large-scale action research. That's what it's about, is trying to figure out how to address these wicked problems. So the first one is reversing the trend in declining literacy rates, increasing rates of Indigenous students, and I could have just said increasing the graduation rates of children from low socioeconomic families and Indigenous families. But Indigenous families are, it's different, as Joanne so nicely talked about. There's difference because many of them have the same issues as low socioeconomic families, but in addition, they've got this overlay of structurally embedded racism and the legacy of the trauma associated with the legacy of colonialism that's been brought so much to the surface in these last few years. So I'm keeping that as it is. And then finally, reducing the prevalence of students suffering anxiety and depression. And so as I go through, I'm going to use Noah as our character that goes through these various sections to see how Noah's progressing as he makes his way along through 3 stages of development that are consistent with the educational prosperity model. So educational prosperity, I had the good fortune, as Thomas was saying, to work with the OECD as a consultant, did a lot of work with the World Bank and UNESCO as a consultant, got to go to, I've been to more countries than my age, I might say, not most of them for work-related things. And as my kids got older, I kept trying to add on 1 or 2 days to see some schools in all these countries. So I've seen schools in a lot of different countries, and mostly I'd say the similarities are more common than the differences. But it's been a fascinating journey in that way. But so when we talk about evaluation, people are always looking for this magic survey, this magic bullet, and they think that, well, gee, if I could just measure kids' skills in the end of grade 3, it's a very important one, or when they enter high school, whatever. But when you think about kids' journey, it's everything that happens. Just imagine a child at Noah there, when Noah reaches age 15, his results, his reading ability, his achievement, his likelihood he's going to graduate, that isn't any that's not all to do with the grade 10 or grade 9 teachers. It's a long journey that happened not at birth, right from conception, right? So that's what I tried to do, is set out a life course model that covers that entire journey. Oops, I clicked a little too fast there. That's okay. So the last slide says there's, here's the full model, and it's in a paper by UNESCO. You can email us and we'll send you a copy of it. Maybe it's a bit dry because we've got a lot of PISA-related stuff. So PISA study of children at age 15, and it's conducted in some 80 different countries. So I met with a lot of the high-level administrators in these various countries when we'd have an OECD meeting, and I'd say, what are the outcomes that are really critical in your country at each stage of development? So we had 6 stages of development, which follow a kind of an international framework for stages. And so those are really consistent across countries up until you get about the 6th stage, then it starts to wobble a little bit. Some countries want kids to be more in tune to citizenship, and some want them all to have a second language, and so on. And then we have the things that drive those factors, which we call the foundations for success. And they're divided into family, institutional, and community factors. So those are the things, and those aren't based on countries' views. These are based on the research. What are the research studies that say, oh, what are the things that drive those early childhood outcomes, say at the pre-primary stage, or that when you look at early primary, what are the things that drive literacy, or reading literacy, and so on. And so in the paper, I talk about 4 ways success develops. And I'm not going to go through all of those right now in the interest of time, but a key one for today's talk is cumulative effects, that you got to have success at one stage of development or things get more difficult. It's really hard to catch up if you don't have success at this stage going on to the next stage, and so on. So, and in particular, if you think about reading, if kids do not learn to read well during those first few years of primary school, very difficult to catch up. I have not seen a country yet or a province yet that has done a really good job of saying, oh, here's our kids who are poor readers at the end of grade 3, but we were able to get them up to grade level by the end of high school. So reading is really core to what I'm talking about. And when we talk about that first phase, I'm talking about those early childhood outcomes that we know are associated with reading, and good reading skills then begets all the other things that come later, educational attainment, how long they're going to be in school, stay in school, their academic achievement, and their health and well-being, and their engagement. And so the last part of my talk is going to be about well-being and how that is related to things that come before and what that framework looks like. And before I go further, there's a lot of discussion these days about equality and equity and models for equality and equity. So this is a framework that I developed for the OECD and then was later adopted by UNESCO. And so when we talk about equality, we're just talking about the outcomes. What's the math achievement for males and females? Or what is the reading achievement of newcomers versus those who are not newcomers to Canada? What is and so on. And so it's really about, and by the way, we're going to send you a copy of these slides, and and it's being recorded too, so, but feel free to photograph. That's equality. How do different subpopulations, and you've got to define those, you can define those as appropriate to your own culture and context, and how does that relate to those widely accepted prosperity outcomes? Equity, on the other hand, is that purple arrow going down to the foundations for success. So those foundations are the things that we know drive the outcomes, and we're saying, who has access to those things? Do our Indigenous students have the same access to quality instruction, to inclusive environments, to learning time, and so on? Do our newcomers to Canada have the same access to those same foundations for success? Now that orange arrow, this was the second part of my misspent youth. I spent probably the first 20 years of my career really looking at school effects. That was the thing of the day, saying what are the factors that are related to a successful school? And some of that's still evident in our school survey today. We have these 10 factors that are related to school success, and we try to measure those and report back on those. When I say misspent, is I spent a lot of time in the technical details of value-added models and all that kind of stuff. How do you adjust for social class? But only in the last 10 years have I been more interested in active research on the ground. So there we go. That's the model. And so really thinking about equality and equity as two, they're not interchangeable pieces, okay? Okay, getting started. So getting started is a title of a really nice report. It was done in the US by a group in 17-state consortium in the US. And I'm going to be talking about this transition from pre-primary to pre-primary into kindergarten. And there's our boy Noah. And the wicked problem is trying to reverse the trend in declining reading rates, literacy rates. So before I had a slide here saying we are stalled. Now the slide says we're declining. We've been in Canada, if you look at the PISA scores, this is students at age 15, they've been steadily falling. And we don't know what it's going to look like post-COVID, but I doubt it's going to be higher. And Alberta was declining pretty consistently down till about 2012. And now we don't know whether the next PISA result's going to be lower or where it's going to be. So we can kind of hope that it's at least staying steady. We'll see. And when you have declining literacy rates, it's not as though you've got this distribution. It's not as though everybody is getting a little bit lower and a little bit lower. It doesn't work that way. The distribution becomes more skewed with more kids falling off the bottom end. And so you get an increase in the number of vulnerable kids. And so the increase of children who are at level 1 and level 2 in PISA, it went up from 28% up to a little over a third of kids. And level 1, level 2, those are reading levels at about a grade 1 or 2 level for level 1, and maybe a 3, 4, maybe level 5 level for level 2. So punchline, a third of our kids in Canada have very low literacy rates. 1/3, 1 out of every 3 kids. And this has a whole lot of implications of how we try to address some of these wicked problems. So kindergarten. I look at kindergarten as kind of a safe haven. It's that transition before they hit grade 1, and it's a way for kids to develop some of those social emotional skills and maybe develop some pre-reading skills and so on. You know that book, no, you guys are all too young, that book called Everything I Should Know I Learned in Kindergarten? Maybe some of you do. So it's like that. And we like to do assessment in kindergarten because things happen upstream from conception right through to when they enter school. So I want to say, how well is our society bringing kids up to the kindergarten door? That's the upstream things. And then downstream is what's going to happen afterwards. And so I had a wise guy who was a very senior administrator in Ottawa. And when I first came out with the book called Vulnerable Children, he said that governments have very blunt instruments. And I would say Joanne does too in the thing. They have money, information, and legislation, what we call MIL. So you throw money at problems, and you can provide information out to schools, and you can also mandate things. And so trying to get that right combination of MIL, of money, information, and legislation, that's the challenge. And that's why you need to know how are kids arriving at that kindergarten door. So when you have an early years assessment, you're really wanting to be able to inform system change. How well are kids making it up to the kindergarten door? What are the long-term trends of indicators of equality and equity? And also identify students that need extra support. And this whole distinction between this high-level aerial data or more local contextualized data and so on, I believe you can do most assessments. You can aggregate them up and get information at all those levels without saying, oh, we just need to focus on this. So when we look at our early years assessment, we can also do early years assessment to support teachers by helps them guide planning, high-yield teaching strategies, resources, and we can identify students that require extra support. And also, it's possible to say, how are kids doing when they come into kindergarten, and how are they doing after they come out of kindergarten? I know a few people here are using the EYE specifically for that purpose, to say how well are kids progressing as they go through. So I love this picture because I'm not sure, he's got kind of a smug look on his face, and she's kind of trying to point out something to him. But I'm just saying, we can reliably measure growth in student skills that are the most predictive of school success. So I want to just give you another little math thing here before I go further, talking about diversity. And all of you know that there's a tremendous diversity, and I'm not talking about diversity by ethnicity and so on, I'm talking about skill diversity. And we've replicated this in a few different countries. When kids come into school, the distribution's skewed, as I mentioned, it's negatively skewed. And so think about kids coming into kindergarten, on average, a little over 5 years old, 4 years, 8 months to 5 years, 4 years, 8 months to 5 years, 7 months, in most provinces. So they're about 5 years old. There's some kids who come into kindergarten and have skills of a 6-year-old. And most kids have skills of a 5-year-old. But there's some kids who are further behind, not only because they were born in a later month of the year, but also because they just haven't had those same kinds of developmental experiences. Not in the previous 2 years, but right from birth. And so that distribution is skilled. And we also have kids going all the way down to children who have skills of a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old, okay? So I'm going to put in a little plug here for I've been playing around with Instagram. I wasn't on there a year ago, but you can go to the Science of Reading on Instagram, and we've got these little posts, and we talk about some of these crucial skills, and we look at a lot of them. There's about 10% of kids who don't say concepts about print or knowing their alphabet. 10% of kids know it really early, but about another 10% don't learn that skill till age 7 or 8. Again, this 4-year age range of some of the critical skills associated with reading. Now, if you go to a low socioeconomic status school, that distribution is skewed the other direction. And this is important. Why? Because you've got kids who are, a lot of the kids in a low SES school have skill levels of a 3-year-old. In some of the communities that we've worked, kids are a year behind when they start kindergarten. Now, that doesn't even make sense. How could you be a year behind? But in the way that we measure things, they're a year behind before they could even get going. And then you can't catch them up. So that's the problem. And then we add on to this responsive tier RTI, and we call it responsive tiered intervention. Why? Because we can identify these categories very early. And so that's a typical, the one on the left is kind of your typical school, but in low socioeconomic status schools, it's very skewed. This is a very old slide, and we haven't updated it, but here you go. I think you'll recognize this city, Calgary, and you'll see I talked to a few principals here, and some of you are principals down in one of these schools where you might have that negatively skewed distribution with about 30% of your kids tier 1 and tier 2. But if you're in a school up in the northeast of Calgary, you can see this is back in 7 or 8 years ago at least. But you'll see there's some schools there where over half of the kids are vulnerable. And I always think of 2 kindergarten teachers waking up in the morning, and one goes to school up in the northeast, another one goes in the south. It's just a different job description as far as I'm concerned. You call you both kindergarten teachers, but whole different job. I'm seeing some nods there of agreement. So what have we learned so far? I have what's called the 50-20 rule. In most school districts, about half of your vulnerable kids, those who are Tier 1 and Tier 2 learning needs, about half of them are in 20% of your schools. So, Lori, how many schools do you have in your district? 50. That's good for my math here. So we would expect that 1/2 of all her vulnerable kids would be in 10 of her schools. And I think you could probably try that out in your own data as well. The link between background knowledge, this comes for those people who did that simple view of reading stuff, that we know we can identify clearly kids' background knowledge, their cognitive ability, and language skills at age 5, and they're very good predictors at their reading skills at age 9 and 10, 8 and 9. That's very well established. And attention and self-regulation skills doesn't get enough play. It doesn't come out as strongly in the prediction models, but that's because there's just a small part of the population that struggle with that. And although it's not important at a macro level, it's very important to those kids. And that's this kind of thing that you can address during that kindergarten year. And then Neil Dabowski, he's presenting later today, walking down the hall with him one day, and he said, what percentage of Indigenous kids have special needs? Because he was working on a program for the folks in Ottawa, a funding model. And I said, I don't know, Neil, but I think it's at least twice. And now we've got enough data from thousands of kids across Canada. It's about 2.4 to 3 times the prevalence of kids who have special needs, who meet the criteria for special needs. And we can identify those kids early. Okay. And remember, I'm saying it's not about Indigenous, it's mostly about growing up in poverty and so on, with the overlay of the effects of colonialization and structural racism. So I always got to remind people that. Okay, I got to keep moving. I'm getting a signal from my CEO. So self-regulation skill. What we learned so far in the classroom, we can teach self-regulation skills. There's a nice little book called Stop, Think, Act, and it's a nice little framework for teaching kids about self-regulation. Okay, here's where you and I might part ways, because I know Alberta was all about inquiry learning for years. There's really strong evidence now that strong guidance, a more direct approach to teaching things, explicit instruction, is much more effective than inquiry-based approaches or discovery learning. And those who want to disagree with me, we might meet somewhere in the middle, that if you're a firm believer everything should be learned with playstations and discovery, it's going to inhibit creativity, my thing would say, then you can explicitly teach kids skills about how to make the best use of inquiry. Children can master many of those critical readiness skills during kindergarten with a variety of hands-on activities, and recently we hear this term minds-on activities, but hands-on activities. And so I give an example of pretend play, which would be an example of that. So for this section, I think there needs to be a shift in thinking. I'm sure some of you are already here thinking about this, but when you read the literature, and there's those play-based aficionados, and then those who want more traditional instruction in kindergarten, it's a false dichotomy. It's not like that. It isn't so they go along in kindergarten doing PlayStation, then boom, they hit grade 1, and now it's work-based education. I think all of education should be play-based and engaging and fun, and you can do that with structured lessons. Kindergarten's a safe haven where children can strengthen their school readiness skills and at the same time developing some of those core social-emotional learning skills, team-building skills especially. And also we know that we can monitor outcomes during the kindergarten year and report results on equality, and equity. So there's the quote from Benjamin Bloom, who brought you Bloom's taxonomy. Those of you who went through school 20 years ago. Now it's Bloom's revised taxonomy. Anderson Krathwohl says, creativity follows mastery. So Ben was a real serious advocate of mastery. And he says, so the mastery of skills is the first priority among young talent. On to number 2. I'm moving right along here, Colette. How's my time? Okay. So the second stage is the transition from learning to read to reading to learn. It was a phrase developed, and I'm blocking on her name now, reading specialist years ago. I heard the expression many times, and some reading people object to it. They say, well, kids are learning while they're reading to learn while they're learning to read. Yes, but that's not really the main focus. So here we have this transition happens, and there's Noah. Okay, he's reading. And the wicked problem I'm kind of focusing on is increasing in graduation rates of Indigenous students. My view is full stop. The only way we're going to get out of this mess is to get kids learning to read. It's absolutely fundamental to everything that comes later. If kids can't read, by that time, after they leave grade 3, as I said, very few societies can bring them along later. And a quote from Benjamin Bloom, but I can't find it, I've been looking for it, is he said, imagine the psychological toll if you finish grade 3 and you go in and every year you're further and further and further behind your peers. And that's exactly how it is. We've got some graphs, that 4-year age range, it just keeps getting bigger and bigger, and the kids who don't learn to read are really quite stalled in their growth all the way along. So an aerial view is we need to change our approach to teaching. There's lots nowadays about science of teaching and moving from a 3 cueing system to a science of teaching phonics-based approach. And the literature about this is so unequivocal. There's been lots and lots of meta-analyses now, and with 3 cueing approaches, and be sure the term balanced literacy isn't balanced at all. It's really 3 cueing with a different name. The effect sizes are around 0.15, 0.2, whereas with phonics-based approaches, the effect size is about 0.7, so, which is an indication of how much growth kids are going to make during skills. So, but my take on this, and having worked on this for a number of years, is that science of teaching is actually something that teachers can learn about fairly quickly, maybe with a little course in a week or so. They learn about phonemic awareness and letter knowledge and concepts about all that stuff, and learn about letter-sound relationships. Getting that knowledge is easy, but to improve skills, you have to have concerted capacity development, changing the approach to teaching, and that's all about the science of teaching. That's where the hard work is in bringing about a change in scores. And then reading interventions, there's also a strong literature on this. I talk about dosage. So a little reading intervention where you pull kids out of the class for, say, 6 weeks or more, 6 or 8 weeks, a couple hours twice a week, very small effects, and they don't sustain themselves. It's ineffective. Not only that, back to my thing about the 50-20 rule and some schools with 50-60% of the kids vulnerable. What are you going to do, pull out 60% of your kids for an intervention, go down and get some magic dust sprinkled on them? Just does not work. They need to be long-term and intensive. I'm going to just say a little bit about this business of science of reading. I did a dry run of my talk a few days ago, and I had way too much on reading, so I've cut it down. This is a model that characterizes this work of Castle, Rassels, and Nation, who were, they were all 3 of them were women who studied under the guru on science of reading. And It's a very thorough report, and it's a bit of a technical read, but we think about this reading occurring in 3 phases, from becoming a reader, which is all about the phonics, learning those phoneme-grapheme relationships, letter-sound relationships, on into orthographic learning, which is learning about the structure of the English language and roots of words, suffixes and prefixes, all of that, and then on to reading comprehension. And we look at, we use this term constrained knowledge, which comes from a guy named Paris. We can identify a really small set of core skills at that first one to constrain it. As you get to phase 2, it's a little harder to constrain it, but we try to. And when you get to phase 3, it's kind of open-ended, it's unconstrained. It's like saying learning vocabulary, learning how to write well. I'm still reading books on how to write well. And it's unconstrained. So getting on with that, and I better get moving here. So first phase, learning how to decode words. Next phase is about learning those established conventions. And then the last phase is about reading comprehension. And at that one, we really there talking about kids shouldn't have to decode words anymore. They've got a really big vocabulary of words that are sight words. And so that's when you're bringing on vocabulary and you're getting that link directly to meaning of words. Alberta's ELA curriculum, something you all love to hate, or hate to love, I don't know. I went through it and I thought, oh my God, this is amazing. I really liked it, and I really liked it for a couple reasons. One is it's so extensive, it covers everything. Another reason I like it is because it's based on the science of reading. And the third reason I liked it is because they've got a little bit of kind of Bloom's revised taxonomy built into it, those 3 levels. But what I don't like about it is there's so many friggin' outcomes. How is a teacher in grade 1 going to manage 300 outcomes in grade 1 and another 300 in grade 2? And remember, there's a 4-year age range. So that teacher in grade 1 has to manage some of those kindergarten outcomes and also be looking at some of those grade 1. So it's really 800 outcomes. So my view on this is that this learning to read in that phase 1, it's really about learning of facts. It's at the very low end of the low corner of Bloom's revised taxonomy, and habit forming conditioning. So we go through that, and we can identify about 20 learning objectives in grade 1 that are absolutely core to learning how to read. They're the phase 1 reading skills. And they've got another 40 ones that are supporting activities. And then everything else is out there that kids learn by osmosis, or what we would call observational learning or implicit pattern learning. They learn the patterns of things. You don't have to explicitly teach it. They just learn it by virtue of being there and reading books and being read to and so on. So to me, the goal here is just to identify those 20 or so core objectives that are absolutely necessary. And by the way, the 6 ways children learn, that comes from a report from the U.S. National Academy of Sciences and Medicine, sadly not from education, about here's the 6 ways kids learn. And again, we can send you that report. You can Google it too. It's called How People Learn, number 2. Okay, high-yield teaching strategies. We're really big aficionados of structured teaching. Well, first of all, knowing where your kids are, then structured teaching, and then getting on to cooperative learning. I won't say a little bit, I've already said a little bit about dosage, that you really got to look at how many intervention hours are actually in play. What's the instructor to student ratio, and the training of instructor, and so on. And keeping in mind that 1 out of 3 Canadian students are struggling readers, so how are we going to make it? So we've been working with a large school division in Manitoba, and I'll just tell you some of the quick lessons we've learned. First of all, you have to create a shared vision amongst especially amongst the principals and the superintendents. Leadership development is played huge in this. Teachers need to be involved in the change process. You need measurable goals. And here's that science of teaching piece. That's the struggle, really, is getting teachers to change their daily practice. And it's a struggle, but that's where you need the leadership development so that the principals are learning about it alongside and bringing and being in their PLCs and so on. Continuous assessment, professional learning community. If anyone wants to see, we've got a maturity model for professional learning communities. What are the stages of development of your school's PLC? And then families are the catalysts for change. We're still kind of midway on that in our second year of this program. We've got more work to do. But also remember, it takes time. You're not going to get there with any short interventions. It's got to, in my view, it's a 3-year intervention. It's a 3-year intervention to transform schools. Michael Fullen says that. Tony Breik, who ran the Chicago Reform thing, says that as well. So in the classroom, all teachers can acquire the core skills of special ed teachers. This would be, I'd be really outspoken. I think in our schools, where you send kids down to the special ed teacher part of the day and back, I think there's nothing magic about special education. You look at your special ed program here, which I have, the category, teaching kids by different categories of disability, it doesn't make sense anymore. That they do mostly all the same things. It's just more often more intense. So classroom teachers can learn all those skills. I think all teachers can have the skills of a special ed teacher. Teaching children in 4 or 5 small groups, where you got the teacher working with 4 or 5 kids, and then they rotate, and the teacher works in another group, that's very inefficient. What you need is a good cooperative learning model where you're following the process of a structured teaching model, and then the teachers has that commanding presence in the room and walking around to the different groups in well-planned groups. And similarly, grouping abilities and effective. So, shift in thinking. Principals play a key role in school transformation. They're the lead learners. They've got to cultivate relationships with school staff to support professional learning and shared accountability. And they're the catalysts, you are the catalysts who build networks to improve the broader education system. Okay, I know I'm over time, but I got to go for another 5 minutes. Sorry, because this is the part that a lot of people are here for, and I'll try to be quick. The Best Within Us, I carry this little book around the world about 4 times called The Best Within Us, and it really was about kids' orientation to well-being. And so here we have Noah talking about reducing the prevalence of anxiety of students suffering anxiety and depression. So when we talk about well-being, it's comprised of children's self-evaluations of how they're doing. Are they physically and mentally healthy? Do they feel safe? Do they have pleasurable experiences, and so on? So you may not know this word eudaimonia, but we're all about eudaimonia, which is different from hedonia, hedonistic values. We all like going to parties, and well, no, we don't like going to parties. I don't like going to parties, but we all like relaxing, having time to do this and that, and so on. And when we ask kids that question, yeah, they like socializing with friends, relaxing at the beach, or whatever it is. Eudaimonia, which we refer to as thriving, it has this root word daemon, which is your true self. Are you getting to know your true self? And which they call the development, Waterman calls it the development of a person's best potential. So it's about getting to know your true self. That's a process that happens early throughout the life course, but especially in high school, where kids have a chance to get to know who they really are. It goes hand in hand with knowing your personal identity too, and your career identity. And I would dare say getting to know your sexual orientation, things like that. It's really key to getting to know who you are. And if I had one measure of well-being, it would be about sense of belonging, because that's actually key. And kids get sense of belonging at school in different ways. The next set of slides I'm going to skip over, even though when I had lunch with Joanne earlier this week, and She said, no, they really need to know about it. So when we talk about looking at this stuff, we talk about a cohort analysis. So these things, I think it just helps as a framework to think about, oh, and here's anxiety. So anxiety, kids who suffer anxiety, they're overly concerned what other kids think about them, what the teacher thinks about them, and so on. So anyway, here's cohort analysis. One way to think about it is there's cohort effects. As kids are going through school, we think about a birth cohort. And we say, what about the kids who were born in 2015, 2016? They're now in kindergarten, grade 1. They're our graduates in 2034. My retirement date, by the way. Planned retirement date. Those are cohort effects. Well, the kids today are different than the kids of 20 years ago. And we know, I worked on a big project in Sweden where I had researchers looking at all of these things. More screen time, of course, than 20 years ago. More cyberbullying, less sleep. They sleep an hour less than they did 20 years ago. More participation in risky behaviors, alcohol, drug use, early sexuality, and so on, gambling. Worry about the environment, poor job prospects, and so on. Those are all cohort effects. Then we've got aging effects, which are things that change as kids get older. So those kids born in 2015, 16, as they're marching along, they're experiencing differences in various outcomes like anxiety or sense of belonging at school. And this is a graph from work in Australia, which we affectionately call the grade 9 dip. When kids hit year 9 in Australia, there's a dip not only in sense of belonging, but in a number of things, and big increases in anxiety and depression. And you'll see the dip's bigger for females than for males. And then lastly, period effects. Period effects are something that happens in a particular period, and COVID is such a good example. And so just the idea of that last graph is just to show you that COVID has affected those kindergarten grade 1 kids. Who knows? Their parents were affected. But what about kids in grade 3, grade 4? What about those high school kids? Different effects. So it's just a way to look at it. So in the news these days, they're talking about this emergency, this they've called a national emergency in child and adolescent health. So they've seen steady increases even before COVID, and now COVID has exacerbated it. And in the US, they were talking about the death of parents during COVID. That just made it even worse. And so we know that the prevalence from our work, the prevalence of Indigenous students who report high levels of anxiety and depression is about 1.5 times that of non-Indigenous students. And amongst LGBTQ plus students, there's also a similar ratio of about twice as much of kids reporting high levels of anxiety and depression. And shift in thinking, we got to move from a medical model to a social model. Just like reading interventions, we can't deal with 20, 30% of our population with a medical model. Well, let's wait till we can get a psychologist or an intervention where we have to change the culture of schools and have really concerted effort to say, what does an inclusive school look like? How are we going to get there? There's still going to be kids that you want to refer to specialists, but relying on specialists is no longer the answer. And that, folks, there's our 3 wicked problems. Can we reverse the trend in declining literacy rates? Can we increase graduation rates of our Indigenous students? And can we reduce the prevalence of students suffering anxiety and depression? I've been called a pathological optimist, and I'm a pathological optimist because I think we can get there because of catalysts like you, and we need you. We can't do it, and especially researchers, we can't do anything, but we need you catalysts on the ground that can really bring about change through strong leadership, through dedicated teachers, family and community support, and maintaining a relentless focus on those foundations for success. Thank you. Sorry I went over time. So. We have a few minutes for questions.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we'll open the floor for Q&A for 10 to 15 minutes. We have a mic, we can pass it around. So.
Talking about the kindergarten level. In my situation, after 30 years of teaching, I've come across the idea that early intervention, starting at 3, I'm seeing wonderful success, at least in my own small niche. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, on a larger scale, is that something that we can begin to start looking at as a society? Can we help our children at 2 and 3 years of age much more so than we're doing with child services at this point in time?
Yeah, so one way that I think about it is you've got a 24-hour day, you've got so many hours where waking hours for the child, and those hours are either with a family or they're a combination of family and some early childhood provision by an institution, let's call it. You don't want to be called an institution, by a preschool. And so if those hours are more efficient in bringing out skills than it is for those just pure family hours, then yeah, that's a good idea. And is it more efficient in cognitive skills? Yeah, I think you can make good mileage on cognitive skills. Language, it's actually harder to make good progress. But is it a good thing? Yeah, I think it's hard to not have it be less efficient than the families who are most efficient in bringing up skills. And then if you think of our more vulnerable kids from, say, low socioeconomic families, then that substitute's important. The problem is it's only 3 or 4 hours a day, and it's hard to compensate for that full day thing. So in my view, I think there's a lot of mileage to be made is through home visits. There's a very good research on home visits and supporting families more directly. And a really good model is the one that's in PEI and the Chances program, where it's both, as they have both home visits and a good preschool program working in tandem. So I don't know if that helps. Any other questions? I know you all want to get out and have a cup of coffee. So, please.
If you can expand on it. So I'm from Al Medina Language Charter Academy. And going back to what she asked, I think for us, because we're focused on ALL, is building vocabulary. Mm-hmm. So early on, we need to do intensive work with building vocabulary. Right. For example, like, I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Dr. Hetty Rosing.
No.
Okay. She's a researcher at the University of Calgary, and her focus is English as a second language. Mm-hmm. So her research indicated when she was measuring vocabulary words, students must have 5,000 vocabulary words by kindergarten. So then we have to work on that, right, in order for them to be able to continue. And then throughout the years, they have to graduate with 15,000 vocabulary words.
Graduate from grade 12?
Yes.
Oh,
yeah.
Even more. Yeah,
it's intensive. So that's a big indicator, like vocabulary building has a high effect on student success.
Yep.
So if you're familiar with that.
Yes. So there's the work of Susan Huttenlocher. If I had more time, I'd pull up the slide where you see the differential growth rates of kids learning language, and it's related to the amount, actually, how talkative the mothers are in her study. But there's another book called Meaningful Differences that talks about differences in language growth rates. So when kids come into kindergarten, we say there's about between 2,000 and 5,000 words in their vocabulary. And then they learn words at a phenomenal rate, 10 words a day. I mean, you can imagine 10 new words a day, and that's how you get up to 15, 20,000 by grade 10, 11. So it's very hard to beat the rate of which they learn words by, if I had those 6 types of learning, by osmosis, basically, through their family context, for their so on. And so I'm not a big fan of teaching language skills while they're learning to decode. Get that decoding done first. That's so critical for them learning to read. And then language skills, and you can't teach decoding anyway without bringing language in, but don't spend half your school time teaching language. If you have in our one district, we have 2 50-minute blocks, and they say, why not one on decoding? And no, get decoding done first. Some kids can learn how to decode in 50 to 75 days. Then when you get into phase 2, when you're learning the structure of the language, then you start to bring in word meaning, and we use a corpus of 30,000 words, so we know the age of acquisition, the age at which kids acquire particular words. And so we want them to have the words of right up to age 8, but we don't teach it explicitly until you get to phase 3, because that's when you really need that. Then they need those words for the meaning. They're learning social studies, they're learning science, they're learning math, and so on. There's very particular vocabulary. So that's.
A lot of kids are good decoders. But when we do the assessments for the beginning of the year,
Yeah.
they're great decoders. What we have a problem with is the reading comprehension.
Yes.
And that's what we're working on.
Right. So you're already at phase 3 if they're good. Well, phase 2 or phase 3 if they're good decoders, and that's fine. And I guess my view is we talk about STEAM words: science, technology, engineering, arts, and math. And so we want to have a course. We've identified core sets of STEAM words, and at the same time, we've got a set of 300 high-frequency words that include not only pronouns and prepositions and the articles and conjunctions, but also some nouns and some verbs, which is missing from the Dolch list of 220. When you have that, then you can make sentences, and that reinforces their language, right? So, yeah. So I think we're on the same page. I just haven't worked with that subpopulation and indeed, those kids, when they come in, they may have learned to decode words, and especially if it's a language that's not a pictorial language, that's a decodable language, right? So, and I'll just make one further comment on that, because Colette asked me the other day, I thought you were in favor of decodable books. Well, here's the thing about the term decodable, which is never taught. There's a word that's decodable is a word that a child can sound out, comma, given the phoneme-grapheme relationships they've already learned. So if they've only learned 10 of those letter sound relationships, then even with 10, you can already decode about 30 words, but that's it. And so you got to keep building that up. And as you're building that up, the words that they have access to that they can decode increases. And so this term decodable books, I say, what do they mean by decodable? Decodable if they know the 23 basic phonemes, or if they know all 44 phonemes, or what is it? That's what. So anyway, I'm not against decodable books. Indeed, we have decodable sentences, decodable passages, but it's decodable in that context. It's building up as you go. So, and that's heavily related to the language stuff too, right? So, yeah. Okay. I think we should have a break.
Yes, so thank you for the...
I'm going to be around. Oh, he was going to let me go on anyway. Thank you very much, everyone. So.